Okay, everyone. Welcome to our Friday edition of the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar series, hosted out of the Boise State Human Environment Systems Group. My name is Matt Williamson. I'm an assistant professor here. Before we get started, I just want to bring your attention to a few logistics. We are recording the session. Once I clean up the video, I will be posting it to the College of Innovation and Design's YouTube channel and sending a link to the email that you use to register. To start out, everyone is muted, and we're asking that you turn off your camera during the presentation just to make the streaming easier. When we get to the end of the talk, please feel free to turn on your camera and your microphone so that I can see if you have questions. If you have questions during the talk, feel free to post them in the chat and I will bring them up at the end. Lastly, you can find, we've got another, what do we have, like 4 more weeks of the semester left. So we've got a great group of talks ready to round out the year. You can find that schedule at the link posted here. Lastly, I don't know about many of you, but I haven't slept a ton over the last 4 days. And so I imagine that between the pandemic and the summer of fires and an election that just doesn't seem to want to end, you might be a little bit tired, maybe a little bit stretched thin. We just ask that you be kind to each other and be kind to yourself. And we're really grateful that you chose to spend part of your day today with us. I'm also extremely grateful to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Jonaki Bhattacharyya. Jonaki is an ethnoecologist, conservation scientist, and environmental planner. She currently works in several roles. She's the management planner and technical advisor in Jillabal trades for Dasiqox, an indigenous protected area of the Chilcotin First Nation communities. She's a coordinator for the Indigenous Guardians Technical Support Team with Nature United, the Canadian arm of the Nature Conservancy, and she's an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Victoria. Jonaki has a PhD from the University of Waterloo and over 15 years of experience collaborating with Indigenous peoples throughout British Columbia and other regions of Canada on wildlife management, stewardship initiatives, and Indigenous protected areas. She specializes in helping communities to develop management plans and biocultural conservation strategies that are based in Indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land. Jonaki is a recipient of the 2015 Wilberforce Fellowship in Conservation Science. And perhaps equally importantly, she makes a practice of feeding her field crews hot scones made on backcountry wood stoves with homemade jam. And if that's not the best introduction I can give, welcome, Jonaki.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And thanks to all of you who are here. I appreciate being able to be here. I'm going to roll forward on this slide here. It is really disconcerting for me still every time we're having events like this and I can't see your faces and I can't be in the room with you. So I really do appreciate you turning up. As Matt said, what a week. And hopefully we can just hold this space for the next hour to explore some ideas together that I hope have oddly some resonance for you during tumultuous times. Make of it what you will. So it's a real honor to be here. In my part of the world, up here, I'm on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island. It's and in my discipline, it's common. I don't know if you do this wherever you are. We acknowledge the territory that we're on. So I am coming to you from the unceded territory of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich people. And I will get into that word unceded. But I find this is a moment to not just pay lip service to that, but to actually reflect on the land where we are. Reflect on the ground that's beneath our feet, on the history and the many other feet that have trodden on that land before us, that do currently beside us, and that will in the future. So wherever you are, I hope that even though we can't go around the room, you can also think about the place that you're in and the other people that dwell there with you. So my approach to today's talk is really that we're just going to take a walk together. I'm going to share some insights from the work that I'm doing, and Matt also asked me to share some personal reflections on my career path and how it plays out in these settings. So I hope that we can kind of find that balance between talking about issues and talking about how we approach working in the realm of those issues in the field that we share. And I'll just invite you to reflect on your experiences and where you see resonance in this. And I'm really interested for feedback. So as Matt said, he told you my name. And my ethnic background is that I'm a first-generation Canadian. My parents moved here in their late 20s. My dad is born and raised in India. So my name is a Bengali name. There's an entire village of Bhattacharyas in a really specific place. And my mother is English. And this will come to play out through the talk today, because I find that who I am, I used to joke that I'm like a colonial mix. That really influences my work and the approach that I bring to working across cultures and with Indigenous peoples here. I've also straddled the social sciences and the natural sciences throughout my education and continue to in my work. And I also continue to keep one foot in academia and one foot in work, sort of the doing of conservation out on the ground. So this concept of edges that I decided to talk about today plays out in literally the blood in my veins, in the work that I do and in how I approach it. And it plays out in the issues that we're all dealing with today. So I'm going to start by just sharing a memory to kind of ground us in this. About 10 years ago, I was paddling a canoe around this lake that you see at sunset, which is something I used to do at the end of a long field day when I was doing my PhD. And I'd had an amazing grizzly encounter that day. Mama with 2 cubs, totally oblivious to myself and my field assistant, swimming across a stream, cubs splashing and playing, and Mama keeping them in line. And it was one of those amazing moments where you're just so glad to be alive and you feel so lucky to be doing what you're doing. And I was paddling in a canoe around this lake, just kind of, we'd go out, listen to the loons, visit the beaver dam. It's at the end of the lake. And I was thinking about how right I felt there. I felt alive and like, this is my place. I'm doing the right thing just in that moment. And yet I was also thinking, isn't it weird that I don't think either of my parents have ever paddled a canoe, let alone in a place remote where you might see grizzly bears. And then I thought, I don't think any of my ancestors probably, really, certainly not in recent history, would be in a position to paddle a canoe. I mean, they'd probably actually wonder what I'm getting out of this, the mosquitoes, the cold. And I just thought it was really strange that a place in which I felt like I'd come home and was really alive, and I felt really most like myself there, could be so far in some ways from who I am in other ways, from where I come from. And the reason I wanted to share that with you is because I think it brings us into this idea of edges, of edge habitat, of finding our own habitat, of who we are when we step into habitat conservation and working with other people. Because this is also a landscape where there are people who have been living there for thousands and thousands of years. So when they think of it as home, they're coming from a totally different place than me. Like, they're literally, physically, their bones are made of this place. They drink the water, they eat the food that grows here. So I find that really fascinating when thinking about diversity. Now, when I talk about edge habitat, this is a nod to a paper that is quite old now. It's 17 years old. It came out in 2003. And it was written, first author is a woman who was my mentor, Professor Nancy Turner, who's an ethnoecologist. And I know there's lots of ways in which we use the word edge ecologically. So edge effect is usually thought of as not a good thing, right? You're talking about fragmentation, usually some forms of degradation, often threats to a particular system. She and her co-authors were coming at it from a different angle. So they're talking about edge habitat as zones of biological and cultural richness, because it's where systems meet, overlap, interact, intermingle, and you can have incredibly diverse, biodiverse regions. You can also have culturally diverse regions in place like this. And they're suggesting that these can be the seat of resilience, because the more diversity there is, the more adaptive capacity you can have. Great paper, if you ever want to read it. Excuse me. So an example of that, this is very close to my home, although we're looking at the large mecca of Vancouver there in the lower corner. You can see two bodies of water mixing. So that silty pale water is Fraser River water. It's meeting ocean water. And you can literally see a line in the water when you can see this from the ferry when you go between Victoria and Vancouver in British Columbia quite often. And you can see how that's playing, how it's spanning out from the river delta in that photo. And yet what you can't see, you know, often when we look at edges, we see the line. But what we also know from this region, this is just one of many examples, is the straits, the Salish Sea around here, this zone where the Fraser River water mingles with ocean water is incredibly biologically rich. And it's the mixing of those temperatures, the mixing of the nutrients in those different bodies of water that has led to that richness. And interestingly, this area historically was also always a meeting place for people from different First Nations up and down the coast who would come to trade. So you always have had cultural richness here as well. So I wanted to just mention that these moments of cultural mixing, this is a photo of just some colleagues in a community I work with. You can see Indigenous elders, you can see visitors from different backgrounds. And if you have a look way off in the background in the left there's the edge of a horseshoes game in which the chief of the First Nation is playing on the same team as that RCMP officer, the police officer standing there with the yellow stripe on his pants. Zones of cultural mixing can be incredibly important. Diversity leading to our ability to be resilient, and I'll get into that a little bit more. Looking at the map of British Columbia, this is not the usual map you see. Again, you're looking at a map that was created to try to depict some of the Indigenous peoples of this province and their territories, largely by language here. This is not nations. There's many more nations than actually show up here. And you'll notice that the cartographers chose to use soft edges because there have always been these edges, these zones of overlap. And this becomes an issue in how we draw boundaries around protected areas now, including the one that I work on. So taking a moment to think then about resilience, it also involves the ability of a system to adapt and recover. This is a photo from my hometown where I am right now, and you can see late 1800s, the houses of the local Songhees people, which are not there today. They were moved onto reserve. They do still live in town, but not, they originally inhabited the zone that's kind of the central business district of this town. Sorry for the blurry photo there. So what I want to land all of these concepts of resilience and edges in is the story of my work, sharing some of the work that I'm doing on an Indigenous Protected Area initiative called Dasiqox. Matt mentioned we're in the midst of changing its name. It's called Dasiqox Tribal Park, and the new name is doing away with the English words altogether. So Dasiqox Nexwagwez. Nexwagwez means it's there for us. So this is giving voice to the Chilcotin people's relationship with their land, saying, well, it's there for us. And I've always found it kind of interesting how you can pronounce that, you can emphasize that sentence in different ways and you get different meanings from it. So if you say, it's there for us, that's them protecting their right to use that land, their constitutional right, their inherent right. If you say it's there for us, it also suggests the relationship that they have with that place, because that land has always been there for them. It provides for them like a family member. It gives them food, sustenance, protection, warmth, everything they need. And in fact, what they actually call their community zones that they look after is caretaker areas. So they also see themselves as caretakers of that land. And to take a moment and get into talking about Indigenous protected areas, again, when Matt and I were kind of discussing how to approach this talk, we discussed some backgrounds. So bear with me for a second, because I'm actually gonna give you a little bit of history. You might already know it. I know you've had Faisal Mullah giving you an awesome talk on IPCAs and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. But let's recap so we can get on the same page. Some basics in history, certainly in the Canadian context, in case you're not familiar. So it's important to know that in Canada, we have a mixture of treaties with Indigenous peoples, and we have also unceded territory. So this is particularly in British Columbia, where I work, and in this area you're looking at in the photo right here, the land was never given away. It was never conquered, it was never relinquished, it was never signed away, it was never sold. And this is what we mean when we say unceded territory. So effectively, and this is something that's playing out in our court system over time, the province, our crown governments are acting illegally when they are making decisions on that land in many ways. It's just that one jurisdiction has overlapped with another. It doesn't make it legitimate. It just means that it's there and it's playing out. And now we're living with it because we all live within that system. So this fundamental land problem it dates back to the time of settlement in British Columbia. Even in areas, other parts of Canada where there are treaties, there's certainly disagreement about what was being agreed to. Because each party could have signed the same agreement and had very different conceptions about what they were actually agreeing to. So that's playing out too. However, it's important to know that there are also constitutionally protected rights for Indigenous people in Canada to use their land. And they often are not being, it's not happening. They're having to go to court to defend their constitutional rights. I'm taking way longer than I meant to, so I'm going to move on. But when we talk about protected areas, it's really key when working in this field to realize that a lot of conventional national parks, provincial parks have been experienced by First Nations people, by Indigenous peoples, as an exercise of state authority. They were often displaced, kicked off their land for those parks to be created. So as much as a conservationist, I mean, personally, I'm grateful in many ways that we've drawn some lines, we've made some edges to our industrial development of the land. They have not benefited Indigenous people in the same way as other ones. So Indigenous protected areas are Indigenous led. And that means that they are stemming from the initiative of Indigenous governance, First Nations. They often have a triple bottom line of ecological protection, cultural revitalization, and economic sustainability as part of the parks or the protected areas mandates. They may not be all pristine. They may be Indigenous peoples protecting their territories even when they've been impacted by industry. And it's also about protecting people's right to use the land, which also differs from conventional parks in many cases where there has not been the ability for people to hunt, fish, harvest in the way that they would. So I'm going to flip forward a little bit into Dasiqox. So you can see where it is down on the side there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we're looking at Victoria, where I am, Washington State here, South Central BC. This is the boundary for Dasiqox. There's a lot of overlapping jurisdictions around there. There's provincial parks, there's recognized land to which the nation has title, there's mineral tenures, forestry tenures, and many other parts to it. Fundamentally, the reason they're declaring this is in response to industrial pressure, particularly mining pressure. They wanted to create a proactive vision for their own future as a people. You're looking at the website, which if you're curious, you can go to find out more about the work that we're doing there. And I didn't mean that one to show up first. I wanted to give you a sense of some of the products we've produced. So this is what's actually involved when you start doing it is draw the line on the map, start the negotiations, and then a hell of a lot of management planning work. So we've started with an inventory of past, ecosystem-based planning, climate adaptation plans, you name it, range management plans, forestry stewardship plans, watershed management plans, full inventory of those, gap analysis, and into the planning. Strategy reports, who needs to do what to start actually creating this? We're doing this from the ground up, and something that many people don't realize is for an Indigenous protected area, there is no manual. There's no recipe book for how you create one. So you've got a group of people who are having to figure this out on the fly. Checking in with the community. A lot of community consultation and actually getting community members' voices involved in what the objectives for the park are, how they want to see that land in the future. And then you need to produce the communication products, which is what these ones on the bottoms are, and I got those a little mixed up on the slide there, to take it back to the community and say, did we get this right? Because when doing this work for a community, I'm that outsider, right? I don't live there. I don't speak their language. I'm not of them. So I can do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of this kind of reporting. I can put all my ethnographic skills to bear to do the interviewing and pull out the themes and listen across culture to what they're telling me is important and how they relate to that land. But I've got to take it back and verify. I've got to ask, did I get it right? There's incredible value to this region in terms of, the natural ecological qualities that people want to protect, the cultural relationships, food security, even a huge part of it. Language is rooted in place there. And this is where, you wouldn't necessarily see this in another form of park, but for an IPCA, an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, a solar farm, starting to think of what does a clean conservation economy look like, and how can the communities that are based in resource areas generate revenue for themselves. And then you've got natural and human disturbances that start to happen. So I'm happy to come back during the question and answer some of the logistical things about what Dasiqo is, but I think we might cover more ground if I actually talk a little bit about, okay, how does this play out, and what are some of the insights that I think it's useful to know? And the first one is, who's actually doing the work? One of the ways that these differ, in my experience, from conventional parks is these are very small, determined teams doing this work. So literally, this initiative is driven by 2 communities of about 400 people each. Each of them has an elected chief and between 2 and 3 councillors. So that's their leadership in elected roles. Not all of those positions are paid. So some of the councillors are actually working day jobs as things like school principals and loggers. And they're trying to govern their communities off the sides of their desks. And the chiefs who are driving this initiative are dealing with everything from literally breaking up a fight in the parking lot during a meeting to national level negotiations with our Prime Minister on issues related across the board, every portfolio in the government that you can imagine, the same 3 to 4 people are handling. So health, housing, resource use, energy, all of it, same people. And these are the same people that sit down at the table and are driving this. So we have a staff of 1 coordinator, myself, and then the elected chiefs and council that are driving this initiative. And so it's really important to recognize how different that is. At the same time, it's an opportunity because we're really taking direction from the community and the elders in these small environments. The reason I wanted to show this slide of the fires in particular is to recognize also that those same people are under tremendous pressure all the time. It's kind of like they're on the defensive because of the resource industrial pressure that's on them. And I know there, our national parks are too, with that kind of pressure. That I think is something that they share in common. And I wanted to mention briefly a little story. In 2019, well, actually, I'm going to back that up. Where you see this fire right now, 2017, and I think a lot of you can relate to these fires after the year that we've had. 2017 was the largest fire year we'd had in a long time in British Columbia. And these communities driving this tribal park actually were literally surrounded by fire. They were evacuated, wondering if their homes were going to burn up. Their government offices were evacuated. And our provincial government took the opportunity while the Indigenous government offices were evacuated and in a state of emergency to issue exploration permits for a mine in their territory for a mine that had been twice rejected by our own environmental assessment process at the federal level. So just for context, that never happens. Like, people joke about our environmental assessment process, basically all roads lead to yes. And in an unreal victory, these two communities had actually fought this project off twice. And then when they're evacuated, more permits were issued. This is in the Dasiqox Tribal Park. The mineral tenures, the exploration permits are for within the declared area of Dasiqox. It's one of the main motivations that the community had to create it. So fast forward to 2019, and we find ourselves in this meeting trying to plan. We're having a strategic planning meeting for Dasiqox. Permits are still holding. Nations have been in court. Everyone's seeking injunctions. The mining companies seeking injunctions against the nation, trying to keep them from blockading. The nation's seeking injunctions against the mining company, trying to stop those trucks from rolling in. And once again, our strategic planning meeting for this protected area gets interrupted by an emergency meeting because the trucks, another injunction was turned down. The trucks are ready to roll. It could be 3 days they might be in there. And we're sitting in the community hall at this point where the nation's saying, do we blockade to protect our land, or do we trust the court system that says you need to have clean hands, you shouldn't break the law when we haven't yet ruled on whether this can go ahead? Another emergency injunction. And they're also literally trying to figure out whether the snow up there is deep enough to hold those trucks at bay until it can be heard in court. And I found that so poignant because we've been fighting this. I've been personally involved in this fight for quite a while, 10 years. And I found myself crying in that meeting at what these people were being put through. And to my surprise, you know, they just dug in and handled it. They were absolutely determined that that mine wasn't going to happen, but they were also cracking jokes at lunchtime. And I thought, how am I don't even have the right to be crying right now. Like, how is this happening? And realize they've been freaking living with this their entire lives. Like, they are planning an Indigenous protected area in spite of this kind of pressure. And I think that's really key to realize, that they're doing it because of that pressure, in spite of that pressure, and through that pressure, and still holding that line. And that's the kind of, you know, work that is going on. So when doing cross-cultural planning work, you know, a big part of our role is to leverage my education, for instance, as I work for them, to help them make the decisions they're going to make. So what does Indigenous led means? It means that they are making the decisions. They are, whenever possible, we're employing, you know, Indigenous people first. It means that they have their boots on the ground with guardians, rangers, and it means that the community, it's rooted in their culture. So I find that I'm bringing to bear, yes, my ecological science expertise to help research and bring in information and manage work that's being done there, but also the social science, the ethnography training I have, I find really useful. I was just realizing this the other day. It's not just the content. It's not just like, I'm going to sit down and interview you and try to understand the culture that you're telling me about. I'm realizing that those skills are actually super useful in meetings, because in contrast to my role when I was in a university setting, in this setting, I have to leverage my listening skills, my ability to hear for themes and pull out kind of qualitative analysis, basically, in meetings, because I'm working with people who are coming from a different culture. And so It's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for the arrogant, because this is not about me making a name for myself. Their voices come forward. And my job is to leverage every single piece of training that I have to support them so that they can make good decisions. Because remember, no advisory team, 3 people, 4 people working every portfolio, making the decisions on this. So the best I can do to leverage my research skills to help them, the better. It also means being what I called, and Matt said, a Jill of all trades. And I hate to break it to you, but imposter syndrome does not end when you leave grad school. For me, it got worse. Maybe it's not that way for everyone when you really specialize, but basically on a small team doing conservation work, you do whatever the hell needs doing. So I would love to be working in wildlife management and ethnoecology all the time, because that really fires me up. Half the time I'm coordinating meetings, I'm facilitating, I'm actually trying to figure out governance negotiation strategy. I don't even have any training in that, but once you hang around long enough and see the kind of barriers these folks are dealing with, you start to get ideas. Like all of us just pitch in and develop a trusting relationship with each other and then do the work. And it's a mutual trust. It has to be. So photos like this of playing a traditional game, I'm still working with the people across that log from me. They invited me in. I had no idea what I was doing. You build trust in lots of different ways to the integrity of your work, but also who you are when you step into that. And that's where who you are, we come back to that mattering. I keep this photo beside my desk while I'm doing this work. This is a photo from, I guess, about 11 years ago now. I'm the one in the hat, and my colleague and friend, Jessica Sita, is the one with the gun. We were out doing field work. She was my field assistant that summer, and she's now one of the leaders who's driving the Dasiqox initiative. I learned from her like anything, and I love that we've had this long-standing relationship now, and each of us has worked for the other. It comes back to that, who are you when you step into the room? This to me epitomizes reconciliation. And by that, I mean, you know, there's a big process that we could have a whole nother lecture on in Canada going on with the reconciliation process. But I find I bring my mixed ethnicity to the table when I'm sitting down and sharing food with people like Jessica too, because even though my ancestors knew nothing like this way of life or these environments, I know what it's like to not be able to speak the same language as my grandmother, in the same way some Indigenous kids do. We also can ask questions and joke with each other and tease each other and respect our elders together and not even always know what each other mean, but learn from each other. And I also think that the other thing that relationship with Jess has taught me is, and not just Jess, all of the people I know well in that community, is that working with people to protect their land is grief work as well as hope work. They've lost so much, and they are still determined to be optimistic, to be forward-looking, and to protect what's left. And I think all of us can often relate on that level. We relate with our hearts on a human level, and then we start getting the work done. And that to me is what pulls us across edges. How we deal with and approach diversity is coming together with curiosity. It's going to be your superpower as students, as learners, to come with a learning mentality, even when you've finished the degrees you're doing. Because it's that open-mindedness, not stepping in necessarily as the expert, asking questions that allows us to deal with and leverage the power of human experience that comes from diversity. I'm gonna leave it at that and pop out of screen share and invite questions and discussion, because I feel like I talked around a lot of things and you guys might have some specifics you want to nail down.
Now I'm trying to find my mute button. Thanks, Jonaki. That was fantastic. Just a reminder for folks, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand by doing that in the participant list, or you can turn on your camera and I can see you, and then I can call on you if you have questions. There is a question in the chat from Ray asking about whether you work with those communities on wildlife conservation issues outside of just the protected area establishment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I try to when I get the chance. So I've done a grizzly stewardship action plan for their area, and my graduate research was on actually feral horses and the impacts. There's also a fair bit of work on moose stewardship, because that's a real important food security species for food security for them. And we're also supporting, I don't work directly, but I'm doing a watershed management plan with them that involves a heavy focus on salmon spawning areas. So I do, and I love doing it. It's not always easy. That's one of the challenges of what I would say cross-cultural work is, I identify as a conservationist, and I'm really driven by that. And I'm, depending on who you're talking to in the community, their perspective on those species may be vastly different. And they might not always share the same values. And so it's one of the areas that's interesting to try to find connection and move forward with shared values, knowing that you might disagree on some stuff.
While folks are thinking of their questions, that your answer sort of leads me to one of the things that came to mind at the beginning of your talk, where you were describing the process of using your ethnography training to kind of listen and then go back and see if you got it right. And I wonder if you have any good stories of times when you may have not quite gotten it right, and sort of how you, given the stakes of everything that is happening in the context of establishing this protected area, how you sort of navigate around those challenges and sort of pick yourself back up after a day that maybe didn't go the way you wanted it to.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh my gosh, there's probably so many occasions that I haven't gotten it right that I'm struggling to think of an individual one. I mean, often humor comes to the rescue there. Like I think, I don't know, I've been like in situations, sometimes it's just minor or not minor, but like, I don't know, you'll be eating with people or getting ready for a meeting, and then I've been shushed when I suddenly realized I was talking and somebody was starting the group prayer before a meal. It's very rude. Yeah, I mean, one thing where I didn't totally get it right was, and that we struggled with, was the actual vision statement for the protected area and the fundamental principles. I used that ethnographic process and qualitative analysis to draft those principles and that vision, but I'm not from there, and I was doing it in English, which is not their language. And so I did, it was really important to go through verification over and over again to take it back, and I did, and people would say, no, you didn't get that right. Like that's not how you should word that, or you need to emphasize this more. And so we built it into the question. So that's one case. But one of the other things that I find actually more challenging is catching myself, because I'm very driven. It's more manners. It's not always content. I can be quite when I get fired up about something, I can be quite forthright. And Chilcotin are a warrior culture. They are fierce. You don't want to mess with them. However, their way of presenting it is very, like somebody will just come up and kind of suggest something, be like, yeah, I was thinking this thing. And you don't even, if you're not paying attention, you don't realize that they're actually telling you the way you need to act. And so it's been more cases where I've realized that I might have actually kind of been a bull in a china shop in a meeting, and I've had to step back, and I've called people and apologized to them before, and just been like, I don't know if I was reading the room wrong there, or was that okay? And then we just talk it out. So that's how I've experienced it more.
Jamie has her hand up, and then I see a question from Peter in the chat. So I will cede the floor to Jamie.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so interesting, and work that I find really inspiring. And I think we all, maybe, I guess I won't speak for everyone, but I am in need of a little inspiration right now. So again, just thank you. And you mentioned how there's no manual to do this, right? Like you're figuring it out as you're going through. And I was wondering if you know of any work being done to document this process, or if it could be applied to other Indigenous groups looking to create their own protected areas. And I have another question, but I'll let you answer that. And thanks again.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I know I felt like when I saw Matt flash the 20 minutes, I was like, oh crap, because I actually was like, there's so much background, where do we, and then it got a bit disjointed. So yeah, there is an initiative now. I'm trying to think where to start. So these areas, there's currently not a legal framework. They're not recognized by our provincial or federal government, in the sense that there is no designation of a thing called an Indigenous protected area in Canada. So where there are ones that have been created, it's usually come through government to government negotiations between the nations and either their provincial or their federal government. And then often the only way that they can actually, even when everyone agrees, the only way they can actually do that is to have simultaneous overlapping jurisdictions or designations. So we've got some that are, for instance, designated as a national park reserve by their federal government, so that they then enact the legislation they need to recognize protection. And at the same time, the nation will then say Indigenous protected area, or they'll call it their own name with their own terms. And they have to come up with a co-management or agreement on how decisions are going to be made on those. And that looks different in different jurisdictions and different parts of the country. And that's why there's no recipe for the end goal or how to get there. And often, like literally one of them out off the west coast of BC has written out of the first page. It's really interesting. It sort of basically both government parties say, we don't agree on who has title to this land, but we've chosen to agree on these management directives for now, while that title. So it even then leaves in question longer term who has title, but they can agree to do it. So stepping into the logistics then, like the actual planning process, I think there was an initiative, the federal government here is starting to get on board. And a few years ago, as part of their targets for protected areas, they created an Indigenous circle of experts, they called it, like a panel was convened to look into this topic, and they released a report, started getting federal money behind Indigenous protected areas. The same group of people, that panel has kind of finished its term now. Many of the same people have moved into an academically funded grant that's 7 years long, called the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And they are working on what they're calling a solutions bundle. Like they're starting to try to compile and gather who's doing what, how's it working, what are the tools. to bring together resources, because as it is, it's a bit ad hoc and everybody just has to kind of like try to find other examples and contact them and be like, will you share your, you know, your plan with us? And a lot of it's confidential and it's really hard to find. So it's starting to come together. It hasn't gelled yet. Long answer.
I think that might actually have also answered Peter's question that's in the chat. And so then it looks like Aaron will be next.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Bhattacharya. Great talk. Thanks for sharing your words of wisdom. I'm interested in that you work in interdisciplinary research and across disciplinary boundaries and with many people from many backgrounds. What have you found about and maybe lessons learned about sharing information? Are there differences in disciplines and among different cultures? And what should we take from that about publishing, giving talks at conferences? Who do you have to ask for permission? How do you go about navigating that?
Thank you. Yeah, that is a big one. I think that certainly as there's a push for transparency in often many of the sciences that deal more with quantitative information in terms of raw data sharing and open source data, which is about increasing rigor and accountability for sure. It doesn't translate comfortably into a lot of this kind of work because so much is confidential. And I think, you know, one could dig very deep into colonial history to understand how information has been used against people. And so there's a natural, like, and still is, I don't want to locate that in the past. I work in environmental assessment processes. It's still used against people, like, and not just that, like on the ground, like people have to be careful even with mapping of cultural resources. Places literally currently will get looted or destroyed if they release information quite often. At the same time, there are also cultural protocols around a totally different way of knowing and relating to information. And so for instance, even in the court cases that this community has been through, there were certain stories that are only to be told at night. There are certain stories that are only to be shared in certain circumstances. So the relationship with knowledge is really different, and that translates into people's comfort with publishing. So a lot of the time, in my world, we're dealing with very confidential information. And often what we'll try to do as a way of providing service to a community and publishing is have a conversation. We're super anal about consent forms, really, really important. So consent, but also to sort of say, you can have, like, we give the raw data to the communities that we're working with so that they get the benefit of that to be able to use in the future. And then we'll have a conversation and say, okay, of that, what are you comfortable sharing? And we'll have that conversation on an individual basis with each person we interview, but also line up a person in the nation or the community who is going to be part of the review process with us before we submit to publication, who can check it over. And if no one has time to read it, then it means a phone call or a meeting where we talk through that. So we find ways to accommodate their busyness. A lot of nations are developing protocols for research and publishing and building that into it. Some of those are becoming open source. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers it. Like, there's probably more there, but protocols, consent forms, and a process for asking and understanding what is allowed to be confidential and what can be shared.
Thanks.
The other one thing, which actually, while I think of it, that's important to mention in terms of one's role, like myself, and this is the cross-cultural thing again, is I have to be aware that there are some things people simply won't say to me. So that was an issue too. Like what we're doing now with the interviewing is we've actually got a community member who speaks the language. So he's going out and repeating a lot of the interviews that I did. because people will tell him things they wouldn't tell me, or he'll understand them differently because he understands the language and then he can translate. So we're actually strengthening the work and backtracking a little bit to catch up to ourselves with people who are from the community to do that work, recognizing the shortcoming, the limitations of my ability. Yeah.
Great question. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can raise your hand or turn your video on or post them in the chat. Oh, here comes one. If there was someone that was about to, or who was added to the planning team, what has that gap been like, and how do you help sort of bridge that gap as new folks come in?
Oh, that's a great question. It changes at different times. So there's been times where we, for instance, we've contracted a lot of stuff out. There's been times where we needed legal advising by someone who understands Indigenous law. There's been times where we needed to communicate, like we hired a comms communication strategist to help with a strategy for how to deal with the media, how to deal with messaging. There's been times where we needed somebody with governance and policy background to help figure out how to translate those Indigenous wishes and concepts into terminology that would like hit at the right level in negotiations with the province and with the feds. So it's really changed. A big thing is also fundraising ability and coordination and facilitation skills. Facilitation has been key. So we had a coordinator for a while who was, just really strong in her ability to gently help a meeting run smoothly while not dominating it. So the chiefs were still in charge, but this, she had the facilitation background to just kind of move things forward, provide the briefing notes that they would need to make good decisions that were informed, make sure everybody the quieter people in the room had a chance to speak, all of those things. So facilitation, and then wherever we're at, negotiating, could be legal, could be planning, could be, sometimes we need a biologist. Yeah, it really varies. I know that's a vague question.
Do you see the question from Jean in the chat? I'm not sure if you're reading it.
I do. Have we made progress in developing consent from an Indigenous perspective? That is a great question. So anyone who's at a university has to go through the ethics board and then also sign a protocol agreement with the nation. In this particular case, the protocol template that we're using was developed by me working for the nation. So it was run through, I would take drafts and then they would say, no, we want this different, we want that different. I don't know if it's really from an Indigenous perspective though. They were just trying to make sure everything was covered off. So I think there's still work to be done on that. I mean, one thing that we do find really key is you don't just hand a form to someone and ask them to sign it. I mean, you know this. Like we spend time talking through orally what this means and why with every single person, and we have the tape recorders running while we're doing that, so that a verbal consent for someone who might not be comfortable signing a form can also be part of that process. But I think there's probably another thing that was more from an Indigenous perspective was the nation chose to develop what they called a relationship agreement. So instead of calling it a consent form, they wanted people to actually agree to the terms of the relationship they would have with each other. And they saw that as it's not a one-off, it's a long-term thing. And that was developed by them for sure. Yeah.
We are at 2 o'clock. Jean, I don't know if you turned on your camera, so if you want to follow up with that question, you should definitely do it.
No, that was great, Jonaki. Thank you so much. I just wanted to let you have somebody to talk to.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
So Thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon and taking a break from all of the things that are distracting today to spend some time with us. We really appreciate it. For students in the seminar, please do continue to ask your questions in the Slack channel. Jonaki will be there for the rest of the week, and we can set up some additional times for folks to chat if you like. If you registered, I'll be sending the video around. Feel free to share it with whoever you might like. And come back next week for our next seminar on Wednesday with Lisa Schulte-Moore from Iowa State.
Thank you,
Have a great
Matt.
rest of
Thanks
your
to all
day.
of you. Good luck. I was waving to Carol there, who
Thank
popped
you.
in, popped out again. Thank you. Is Carol gonna stand there? You're muted, Carol.
Great to see you, Jonaki.
Great to see you.
Thanks so much for spending the time with us.